I'm honored to invite Danny Grossman to join us on the Bima. Danny has served the U.S. Foreign Service as a diplomat overseas with a focus on human rights, particularly Soviet Jewry. He served on many local boards, including Stand for Children, the Stanford Center for Ethics, and he was previously the CEO of the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund. He actually has a much longer bio than this, but he told me to shorten it, so I'm doing my best. And I think, extremely importantly, he served as a member of our first Welcome Circle and played an integral role in assisting Kolya, Natasha, and their two daughters, Nellie and Nicole, to come to the US in October of 2023 and help them throughout their journey. We're very proud that he's a member here, and we're honored to learn from him tonight.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi Rina, for that introduction. Could have been briefer, I think, but it's really a privilege to represent Hayas this evening. We've been working on behalf of forcibly displaced people around the world for over 120 years. The mitzvah of welcoming the stranger is the most oft repeated in the Bible, no fewer than 37 times. It is one of our most deeply held values. Sadly for me, however, it's not in this week's Parsha, Tetzaveh. But as I read, I found this intriguing line. Aaron shall carry the names of the peoples of Israel on the breastpiece of judgment over his heart when he enters the sanctuary for remembrance before God at all times. I read that, and I was struck that when we go before God or are otherwise engaged in sacred activity, we should carry the names of the people we represent. And that insight brought me back to a stuffy conference room in the State Department. I was there as a U.S. diplomat representing the U.S. delegation and meeting with my Soviet counterparts. While the Secretary of State, George Shultz, and the Foreign Minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, were upstairs talking principles, including human rights, we were downstairs talking tachlis. We got specific. We named the names of Jews who had been refused permission to leave the Soviet Union, so-called refuseniks, and we pushed for their release. I always carried a thick book. Think phone book, if you get that reference. Sorry, outdated. It included the names of more than 50,000 Jews in the Soviet Union who had been refused permission to leave. And as we processed name after name, they said, Shapira, Lev, we have no information on him. And I nearly leapt out of my chair because when I lived in Leningrad, I met them many times, Lev and his family. And I said, Kanal Gribayedova, number 13. You'll find him and his family right there. And a month later, they got their visas and they left the USSR for Israel. Remembering the people we represent is important. It's humanizing and it's galvanizing. It's why we remember the 6 million murdered in the Holocaust. It's why we wear necklaces with the name of hostages. It's why they're on the table outside, and if you haven't seen it, you should. And it's why we must remember the refugees fleeing persecution and danger around the world. As I said, it's my great honor to be here on Refugee Shabbat. I have such deep appreciation for Congregation Emanu-El, everything that we do for refugees, not least of which is the formation of the welcome circles that you've heard about. Hayas is proud to sponsor Refugee Shabbat worldwide, so that at one time, or within a space of weeks, we can all remember the plight of forcibly displaced people. Last year, when we observed, there were 100 million forcibly displaced people around the world. This year, 120 million. 120 million. Now, I'm aware that many of you know, and certainly we've heard the stories, Hayas for our work in resettling Jews in this country, including and especially Soviet Jews in this country. We resettled most of them here. Or the resettlement of Afghans and Syrians and Ukrainians, including the Taranov family and the Akuleventina families. This work remains essential to who we are, and it always will. But because only a tiny percentage, less than 1% of those 120 million people will ever be resettled safely, we've been called upon in recent years to provide services globally to refugees who are displaced. We support them in 4 important ways. One is providing legal guidance, mental health support, economic empowerment, and the prevention of gender-based violence. And I think you probably all know enough about the fate of refugees to know why those 4 things are so important. And this Refugee Shabbat is unquestionably the most important in our history. Because all of this work, everything that we've smiled and shept nachas about, that we've seen here on the Bima, is under threat. The assistance we provide the stranger abroad and resettlement in this country. We all expected this administration to target refugees on day one. We heard enough rhetoric, and we remember the first round. But the manner in which this is being done and implemented is astonishingly comprehensive and breathtakingly cruel. Let me remind you, in the first week, the administration ordered the end of birthright citizenship for undocumented immigrants, suspended the U.S. refugee program, ended humanitarian parole, terminated the program that allows migrants to apply for asylum, which is, by the way, part of a national convention that we're signatories to, and implemented a 4-month pause on all humanitarian aid and foreign assistance. This has caused unimaginable suffering for millions of people around the globe, and I want to just try and capture one family's suffering. This is a family that we've worked with in South Sudan, and, well, they're from South Sudan. We worked with them in Kenya, where they qualified as refugees in the year 2000. 2 months ago, they finally got their approval to come to the United States. Now, they live in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, so they had to fly to Nairobi. But their daughter wasn't allowed to fly because she didn't have the right documents. So they boarded the flight to Nairobi and waited for her to follow. But she couldn't. She couldn't get the documents in time, and they had to face the impossible decision of leaving her behind or realizing their dream and coming to the United States. And they left, and they're here now. And she's there, and their 24-year odyssey is far from over. What we're witnessing appears to be a full-on assault on both the U.S. long-time practice of providing foreign humanitarian aid and the practice of welcoming refugees. While Hayes continues to do everything we can, you heard earlier that our funding has been cut. 60% of our budget was cut in one day with the U.S. government's stop work order that was directed at us. And to underscore the challenge and the venality of the intent, funds that we had spent prior to that stop work order, based on our agreement with the U.S. government, have not been paid. So we as an organization have decided to focus on litigation because, as I'm sure you're all aware, there are only so many levers here. And we happen to be very good at that. We did this in 2017 to good effect, and we've had some victories. On February 13th, a federal court in D.C. issued a temporary restraining order to stop the withholding of foreign assistance. And although to this day we haven't seen the spigot turn back on, 2 days ago, as you may have all seen, the Supreme Court remarkably upheld the decision of the lower court and ordered the foreign aid to flow. Last week, in Seattle, a federal judge ruled that Trump did not have the authorization to close the U.S. refugee admissions program. That's a whole separate consideration. And finally, on that same day in D.C., a judge ruled that the administration was obligated to compensate within 48 hours the work already completed. We haven't seen any of it. We haven't seen $1 because everything's in appeal. But we will continue to fight. It's not a fight we wanted, but we happen to be pretty good at it, and we've landed some counterpunches. It may be hard for you to imagine what's happening in the humanitarian sector, although Rabbi Bauer gave you a hint, because I wasn't supposed to be speaking tonight. Thousands and thousands of people across the sector, including Linda's and my nephew, who's getting married next week, have lost their jobs because of the spigot was turned off, and organizations, rather than go out of business, have had to cut deeply, including the person who is supposed to speak tonight, and I'm sorry to say not 60 others, but 500 others. But most of all, let's be clear, these decisions are a devastating blow to the people we represent. Tens of millions of people are being dramatically affected. Some of them are not so different from us, like the Jews of Ukraine, and some are very different, like the Rohingya of Myanmar. They are united only in that they are strangers in a strange land. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, I used to think that the most important line in the Bible was love your neighbor as yourself. And then I realized it's easy to love your neighbor because he or she is usually quite like yourself. Then I realized that it's easy to love your neighbor. What's hard to love is the stranger, one whose color, culture, or creed is different from yours. That is why the commandment, love the stranger because you were once strangers, resonates so often throughout the Bible. It is summoning us now, and it's beautiful to hear it connected to the legacy of our work in welcoming families from the Pesach of 2 years ago. So I know we're weary of political battles, and many of us are tempted to just take a leap of faith that it will all work out in the end. But I'm reminded of the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, we're commanded not so much to take a leap of faith, but a leap of action. And I know this is what we do at Emanu-El. It was just announced. And there are certainly actions we can take. And here are some of the things. First of all, participate in Emanu-El's Do One Thing program, which starts this coming Thursday on March 13th. Do one thing and then do it again. Join the Jewish Public Affairs Council's lobbying event in Sacramento in May, open to everyone. I went last year. You will lobby assemblymen and senators on issues of importance, including these issues. Call your senators and members of Congress. Show up at local forums to represent migrants who are unable to show up themselves. And support this synagogue and support HIAS financially to continue to engage in the sacred work that we are all undertaking. And when you do this sacred work, wear your breastpiece of judgment over your hearts, like Aaron and the priests, and remember before God those you represent. Shabbat shalom.